Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Prior to last November's election, there was a lot of talk about how the results might change California's political landscape. Some argued that the results actually did change the political landscape, helping Republicans win back the House. Others would argue that really, when the smoke cleared, everything pretty much stayed the same. Which explanation makes more sense? We're fortunate to be joined by 2 of the most astute observers of California politics. We have Laurel Rosenhall, who's the Sacramento Bureau Chief for the LA Times, and Dan Walters, longtime columnist for CalMatters. Thanks very much for being with us today.
You're welcome.
Thanks. So listen, Dan, let me start with you first. It was another sweep by the Democrats of statewide offices. Republicans haven't won a statewide office since 2006. Other than the obvious, that Republican candidates don't appear to be really viable statewide, were there any other takeaways from these races, statewide races?
No, I don't think there were any statewide. There was a fairly valiant effort to win the state controller's office by Republicans, and the candidate got a lot of editorial support and whatnot, but in the end, he was a Republican, and so he had really no chance of winning that office.
Yeah, and putting an R next to the name seems to be pretty typical for candidates because he had a very impressive resume. Laurel, it is what it is. The registrations are what they are.
Voters are very calcified, so there's just really very little opportunity for crossover appeal. I mean, that's the bottom line. So that's what we saw in all of the statewide races. I would say the only other takeaway in this election for California is that California voters overwhelmingly support abortion rights. Prop 1 on the statewide ballot got more votes than any Democrat on the statewide ballot. It got 7.1 million votes. So that means there were people who were voting in favor of Proposition 1 to put the right to abortion in the state constitution, who did not vote for Gavin Newsom or any of the other Democrats on the ballot. So that was one noteworthy takeaway that I think hasn't gotten enough attention.
Any other takeaways, Laura, from the propositions from your perspective?
Oh, just that the power of money isn't always as much as you think it will be. I mean, the sports betting initiatives spent record-breaking amounts of money, $500 million, and lost by a landslide. So that was just really interesting because money doesn't always equal success.
Money doesn't always matter. I think, what do they say, that money is the mother's milk of politics? Maybe yes, maybe no. Dan, the propositions, it seems like Republicans are really relying on, and business interests are relying on propositions and maybe court decisions to kind of thwart some of the work of the legislature. Is that what we're going to see going forward?
Yes, we will. We've seen it already over the last several election cycles of business organizations who have felt the sting of the legislature, so to speak, efforts to change their business practices, in some cases put them out of business altogether, like the bail bond industry, striking back with either referendums to overturn the law or initiatives to replace the law, repeal the law, and mixed record of success. Some failed, some succeeded. This year we saw something by the tobacco industry to overturn a law banning the sale of flavored tobacco products. They spent a lot of money putting it on the ballot, didn't spend very much money to campaign for it, and it lost. They lost, I should say. The state law won, the industry lost. But as we've noted in other venues, it bought them time, because once you qualify a referendum for the ballot to overturn a state law, that state law goes into suspension until the voters have spoken. So it can be as much as 2 years of continuing business as usual while you're waiting for the voters to. And there's some indication that these industries do this just to gain that extra time to do business rather than make a serious effort at overturning the law. I think it depends on the industry, it depends on the issue. But we're seeing that this year we're going to have 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 referendums on the ballot in 2024. Yeah, it's going to be a new trend in California politics. Business groups are going to try to thwart the legislature by putting measures on the ballot, either referenda or initiatives.
So, Laurel, that kind of goes to you in terms of the California legislature. We now have a super Democratic majority. Are they going to take this up, make it more difficult to get these on the ballot? I mean, what are the implications of the Democrats even having a larger majority of the state legislature?
Well, they can pass things with a supermajority vote, a 2/3 vote, and still have votes to spare. So it is possible that they will be looking at some changes to the initiative or referendum process. But I will say that they had a supermajority last year, and they had a concerted effort to try to change the recall rules and the laws surrounding a recall following the attempted recall of Governor Newsom. And even though they had the votes technically to do that, they had a supermajority, they did not land on a proposal that they felt confident that voters would support. And so they never moved ahead with anything last year. So I think that it will be an issue that they take up and that they consider this year. Whether they can get to something that puts on the ballot is the really big question we'll be watching.
Okay, so up next, we're going to take a look back at what the state legislature and the governor did in 2022. That's going to take effect in 2023. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking state politics with Laurel Rosenhall, who is the Sacramento bureau chief for the LA Times, and Dan Walters, who's columnist with CalMatters. So, Laurel, I want to ask with you, let's look back at 2022 and talk about the governors and some of his hits and misses in 2022. What would you say?
Well, in terms of legislation, his big success was getting this Care Court initiative through the legislature. It was very controversial because the ACLU and other civil liberties advocates said that it would be forcing treatment on people against their will. The idea behind this bill is to compel people who have severe mental illness to get treatment and create a process where we can the goal is to get the most severe cases of mental illness off the streets and out of homelessness, although the process would also apply to people who have severe mental illness who are not homeless. So that was really controversial, and Newsom did get it through the legislature in the end, and it's going to phase in at the end of 2023. So we'll see how effective it is at making a change. And then in terms of a big loss in the state capitol, Newsom had backed a whole package of gun control legislation. And there was one very significant bill that has to do with the concealed carry laws in California, which were basically struck down by the Supreme Court in a case concerning the New York law. And there was an attempt to write California's law, rewrite it in a way that would comply with this Supreme Court ruling, but also advance a lot of Democrats' goals for major restrictions on who can carry concealed weapons. And that, in the end, failed by one vote on the assembly floor because it couldn't get supermajority support from Democrats. And so that was a real failure for Newsom, who had put his weight behind this, and the attorney general who sponsored it, and they couldn't get it through because of their own party.
Yeah. So Dan, hits and misses for the governor and the legislature in 2022.
Well, I think that you can point to a lot of things. He got a whole package of environmental bills right towards the end of the session, kind of angered some of the Democrats by springing it on him at the last minute. So I think that was a success, I guess. He got what he wanted. There was one thing that was kind of a tweener, a success and a failure in a way, in that he had indicated he had vetoed a bill making it easier for the United Farm Workers Union to win representation elections. And then the bill came back this year in a slightly different form, and he gave every indication that he would veto it again if it got to his desk. His spokesmen were criticizing it, saying it didn't meet the standard, blah, blah, blah. But in the end, he signed it after the president of the United States, Joe Biden, weighed in and said, "You got to sign this bill." And it was kind of kind of a one-upsmanship, I guess, on Newsom by the White House. But it was a very interesting episode in its own way.
What about the fast food worker bill that's going to be challenged by the restaurant industry? Laurel, was that a victory, a temporary victory, or what?
Well, that's a complicated one. That's one that Californians should all be aware of, because it's going to either be on the ballot as something that people will have the option to repeal in 2024 if they want to, if the signatures are valid and it's qualified for the ballot, or if it doesn't get on the ballot, it will go into effect and it will create a new council that can weigh in on wages and working conditions for the fast food industry, potentially raising wages for fast food workers up to $22 an hour. So that would be something that would have an impact on a lot of California households, whether they're workers in those restaurants that could potentially see higher wages, whether they're franchise owners that would have to pay the higher wages, or whether they're people who enjoy eating at fast food restaurants who might see prices go up a little bit.
Yeah, and I think other states are looking at this too, and that's why the restaurant industry is really looking at seeing if they can beat this back. Well, up next, we're going to talk about what does it mean to have a Republican House majority, a conservative Supreme Court facing off against a Democratic president, and a Senate that's controlled by the Democrats. What does that mean for California? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Dan Walters, a columnist with CalMatters, and Laurel Rosenhall, who is the Sacramento bureau chief of the LA Times. So, Dan, let me ask you about this. We have a change in House leadership. Some would say a pretty big change from a San Francisco Democrat to a Valley conservative. What are the implications for California and the Valley?
Well, we're assuming that Kevin McCarthy is going to be elected speaker. Some people think he's not conservative enough, which is why he might not be elected speaker. That's neither here nor there. I think the potential importance of having Republican leadership in the House, particularly if it's Kevin McCarthy from Bakersfield, would be that there are some issues that do resonate for California in the national arena. And one of them certainly is water, because so much of the water in California is controlled by the federal government through the Bureau of Reclamation and the Corps of Engineers, actually. I think that it will give California a somewhat stronger voice in the national water situation. Even though the Democrats still control the Senate, even Democrats control the White House, it will give California Republicans a voice in those decisions. And there are some very big decisions coming up, particularly, for example, on the Colorado River, whether California is going to have to make a big cut in the water it takes from the Colorado River. So I think if there is a national implication in the change of leadership in the House, it probably has to do with water, that most significant issue.
Yeah, and the other issue, I guess, of course, because Kevin McCarthy's from Kern County, is going to be oil and gas. So, Laurel, any implications for the state and for the Valley in particular?
Well, I think it will be a rare opportunity for the red regions of California to have national prominence, which most of the nationally prominent Californians are Democrats. So this would just be an unusual opportunity for the conservative parts of the state to have their viewpoint heard and in leadership at the highest levels of government.
Yeah, and it seems the Valley Republicans had some success. I mean, David Valadao won re-election. John Duarte, north of Fresno, won election. So the Republicans had some success in Central California. Dan, I want to ask you, there's been some talk about Governor Newsom potentially running for president. He's saying he's not going to do it. Some would say, the government doth protest too much on this issue. What do you think are his presidential ambitions going to impact how he acts in 2023?
Well, they may, but I think the thing is that Gavin Newsom does intend to carve out and maintain a national profile for himself as basically a voice for more democratic activism, more stauncher opposition to Republicans and that sort of thing. So whether he runs for president or not, and I don't think he will be in 2024, as it turns out, he is building a national reputation for himself, maybe for 2028, if the White House is vacant in 2028. That's a possibility. It's also a possibility he could run for the U.S. Senate in 2024 if Dianne Feinstein gives up her seat, which is at least a 50-50 bet that she will. As I've said before, the guy has spent half of his life climbing up the ladder, one rung at a time. I just don't think he's going to stop on next to the top rung.
It seems
wine or something like that. I just don't. Right. It just doesn't seem to be in his nature to do.
So, what do you think? California's got this, image, at least in Republican circles, of being crime-ridden, overpriced, a lot of homeless. He's got to address those issues if he's going to be a national candidate.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing from Newsom right now are actions that show that he is sort of preparing to get lucky. Should all the stars align and there be an opening, whether it's in 2 years, which seems unlikely, or in 6 years, he's taking steps. He's made it clear that he wants to be a national player in terms of advocating for the left worldview and being a voice that fights back against Republican messaging and Republican policies from conservative states. So everything he's doing it makes sense to kind of boost his image and prepare for, the what ifs. There's a lot of unknowns that can happen in the future, and he wants to be in position.
It's interesting that both of you think that President Biden is going to run for re-election. At least you seem to be implying that. I think age is going to be an issue. And I think that also some implications of Kamala Harris being vice president, unless she gets her numbers up. But that's also an issue for 2024. But we'll leave that aside for now. When we come back, we're going to talk about the political issues that are going to be debated at the state capitol in 2023. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking about state politics with Dan Walters, columnist for CalMatters, and Laurel Rosenhall, who is a Sacramento bureau chief for the LA Times. So Laurel, let me ask you, the big political issues in 2023, is it going to be more of the same, housing, homelessness, crime, or something else?
Yeah, I think housing and homelessness will continue to be a huge issue in the state capitol. And then, of course, we have this proposal from Newsom on a penalty on oil company profits. This is his attempt to reduce gas prices or punish oil companies for excessive profits. The details are still TBD. He hasn't released them yet, but he called a special session of the legislature to address this. So we know it will be a big focus of their time.
Yeah, and so TBD is for sure. It's like, what's the penalty? What are the standards? There's a lot of blanks there. So Dan, going to fill in the blanks on oil and gas and alleged price gouging. What other issues are going to be front and center for the legislature and the governor in 2023?
Well, the governor said that he was going to devote his second term to homelessness and the housing crisis. Of course, he said that a couple of years ago, I think, as well. Look, this thing has just gotten to the point where people are just fed up with it. And I think they're going to demand not only the governor and the legislature, but other officials at the local level, like the new mayor of Los Angeles, said, you got to do something. We have to start seeing some results. You keep telling us what you're going to do. You keep spending money on it, but we're still seeing a lot of encampments out on the sidewalks, and we're tired of it. I mean, that's kind of the gist of the public's attitude about it now, and they got to show some results. They can't just keep saying, we're going to do something about it, or we're throwing some more money at it or something. They have to start showing some results of getting the streets and the sidewalks of California cleaned up.
Well, the question is, can they throw money at it, Dan? I mean, the state is looking at some budget deficits here. It seems like the LAO is saying some of the things you thought you might be doing going forward, maybe you want to hold off on those.
I think the indication is from the legislature in their initial responses to the budget that they are going to be willing to borrow money to cover deficits and maintain spending pretty much as they already intended to do. The outline of the budget from the assembly was we'll borrow money to cover the deficit if we need to, and I don't think you're going to see some big cuts in spending. I think you just might see some kind of stalling out, spreading things out a little bit, putting off what you can put off, not spending the money that doesn't have to be spent yet, that sort of thing. But I don't think you're going to see the kind of budget crises that we have seen in past decades and even earlier in this decade or last decade, as we saw in the past. And they have they've got a lot of reserve money.
Yeah, I was going to say, what's a rainy day fund for, right?
Well, the rainy day fund is there, and but it probably would not be enough to cover a serious recession-induced deficit. And that's where they would probably have to borrow the money to get through.
Laura, what do you think about that? How big is this budget deficit how big a role is it going to play in legislation going forward in 2023?
Well, I think think that the real question is, how much is it going to scale back Newsom's ambitions for some of the programs he's already launched that have a gradual phase in over the next several years? Things like universal preschool, Medi-Cal insurance for all low-income Californians, regardless of age or immigration status. Does it kind of scale back those ambitions on promises he's already made? Does it put him in the role with the legislature, as we saw with Jerry Brown, of trying to be the adult in the room who would, be the kind of the scold to keep the legislators in place? Maybe good timing that there are so many new legislators coming into the Capitol right now, because there will be a sizable chunk of them who have not lived through the boom times of the last several years. And so maybe they won't think it's normal to, spend $300 billion on a state budget. But yeah, it will definitely change the ambitions of what's doable.
Yeah, I want to ask you, Dan, in terms of we only got about a minute or so left, but I want to ask both of you if you can fit it in. What do you think are going to be the big stories that maybe really going to be a little bit overlooked in 2023, but really people should be paying more attention to?
Well, as I've written many times, I think the big story of California that's not getting enough attention is their crisis in K-12 education. The rather abysmal record that California students have on state and national achievement tests, and which is going to hurt the state entirely in its economy, but it's also going to hurt those kids if they can't get the educations they need to be employed and prosperous and self-supporting in the future. I think it's just a truly existential crisis that needs to be addressed.
Okay, about 20 seconds, Laurel. What do you think? What are the stories we should be paying attention to?
What happens with Dianne Feinstein and the campaign to replace her, assuming that she doesn't run for re-election? There's been a whisper campaign, kind of a shadow campaign for the last year or so, and I think that we could see that blown out into the open next year. She's a trailblazing leader and longest serving female United States senator. But it may be that she's not up for another term.
That's going to be the big issue. I want to thank our guest Laurel Rosenhall with the LA Times Sacramento Bureau Chief, and Dan Walters with CalMatters. If you want to stay current with state and local politics, you can log on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Institute. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.